Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might lull you into the deepest sleep of your life. The utterly exhausting reality of surviving in feudal Japan when samurai ruled the land, and your life expectancy was about as reliable as a paper umbrella in a typhoon. We're diving into what life was really like for the 99% of people who weren't swinging katanas or composing haikus about cherry blossoms. They were too busy trying not to starve or accidentally offend someone who could legally cut them in half for improper bowing technique. Forget the noble warriors and elegant tea ceremonies Hollywood sold you. Those were for the elite few, the samurai equivalent of trust fund babies who got to practice martial arts while everyone else practiced not dying from dysentery. The truth is, if you were dropped into medieval Japan as a common person, you probably wouldn't survive 24 hours. You'd be dead faster than a rumor spreads in a rice farming village. And believe me, that's pretty fast when entertainment consists of gossip and watching grass grow. So before you get comfortable in your modern bed with its miracle of memory foam and climate control, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the lives of people who never traveled beyond their village boundaries. Because leaving your designated area without permission meant becoming practice material for samurai sword techniques. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A journey through rice paddies, rigid social hierarchies, and the kind of survival that makes modern stress look like a gentle meditation retreat hosted by someone who actually wants you to succeed. You wake up in rural Japan. The year is 1500 and something. You're not sure exactly what year because calendars aren't exactly a priority when you're focused on not dying. The sun hasn't risen yet, but you're already awake. Not because you're an early bird or practice mindfulness. You wake up because your body has learned that sleeping past dawn means missing the brief window where you might find something edible. Your bed is a straw mat on a dirt floor. No box spring. No pillows. Just you, some scratchy straw, and the constant awareness that something might be crawling on you. Could be insects. Could be small rodents. Could be something worse. You don't investigate too closely because ignorance is literally the only luxury you can afford. The walls around you are made of wood and paper walls, in a country known for earthquakes, typhoons, and general natural disasters. It's like building a house out of tissue paper and hoping for the best. But this is what passes for architecture when your entire family income couldn't buy a modern doorknob. You stretch, and every joint in your body protests. You're 25 years old, but feel like you're 60. That's because you've been working in rice fields since you could walk. Your back is permanently curved from bending over crops. Your hands are permanently stained and scarred from farm work. Your feet are rough as leather because shoes are a luxury reserved for people who don't spend their days standing in muddy water. Outside, you hear the sound that will define your entire day. A bell ringing. Not a gentle church bell or a school bell. This is the work bell. The sound that means you have exactly 0 time to waste because daylight is burning and rice doesn't plant itself. You stumble outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of human waste. Because guess what medieval Japan used for fertilizer? That's right, human excrement. Every morning starts with the delightful aroma of processed human digestion mixed with rotting vegetation and general decay. Your neighbor Hiroshi is already outside, looking as miserable as you feel. Hiroshi is 43 years old, which makes him practically ancient by medieval Japanese standards. Most people don't live past 50, and those who do are considered miraculous survivors. Another beautiful day in paradise, Hiroshi mutters, but not too loudly. Sarcasm is dangerous when samurai might be listening. Complaining about your lot in life can be interpreted as questioning the natural order, and questioning the natural order can get you killed faster than you can say social mobility. At least it's not raining, you reply. immediately regretting your words as you feel the first drops of moisture hitting your face. Of course it's starting to rain. Because the universe has a sense of humor, and that sense of humor involves making your life as difficult as possible. You and Hiroshi walk toward the rice fields, joined by other villagers emerging from their paper houses like reluctant actors in a play nobody wants to perform. There's Kenji, who lost 3 fingers to a farming accident last year and now works twice as hard to prove he's still valuable. There's old man Tanaka, who everyone expects to die any day now, but keeps showing up for work anyway because retirement isn't a concept that exists yet. There's Yuki, one of the few women visible at this hour. Most women are already inside preparing the morning meal, which consists of rice, if you're lucky, or rice mixed with whatever else you can find if you're not. Yuki's husband died of fever 2 winters ago, leaving her to manage everything alone. She's 28 years old but looks 50 because stress ages you faster than time itself. Did you hear about the tax collectors coming through Yamada village? Yuki whispers as you walk. News travels slowly in feudal Japan, but bad news travels fastest of all. What happened, you ask, though you already know it won't be good. They took everything, she says. Left the families with nothing for winter storage. Some people are talking about eating bark again. Eating bark. That's not a metaphor or exaggeration. When rice runs out and there's nothing else available, people literally eat tree bark. They grind it into powder and try to make it edible. It doesn't work very well, but it fills your stomach temporarily and gives you the illusion of eating food. You reach the rice fields as the sun finally appears on the horizon. The landscape stretches out before you in neat, organized rows of flooded paddies. It looks peaceful from a distance. Serene even, like one of those landscape paintings that make farming look romantic and pastoral. Up close, it's a different story. The water is murky and filled with things you don't want to think about. Leeches, parasites, various forms of bacteria that would love nothing more than to find a way into your bloodstream through any available cut or scrape. You wade into the water, feeling the cold shock against your legs. The mud at the bottom is thick and clingy, designed to trap your feet and make every step an effort. This is where you'll spend the next 12 hours. Standing in this water, bent over rice plants, performing the same repetitive motions until your back screams and your hands bleed. The overseer, a man named Nakamura, watches from the dry ground. He works for the local daimyo, which means he gets to stay dry while you get to experience aquatic agriculture. Nakamura carries a stick, not for helping with the work, but for encouraging people who aren't working fast enough. Move faster, he calls out. The daimyo expects this field finished by evening. The daimyo, your feudal lord, a man you've never met but who owns everything you see, including you. In feudal Japan, you're not technically a slave, but you're not exactly free either. You're bound to this land and this work for life. You can't leave, you can't change jobs, you can't decide you'd rather try something else. You're stuck here forever, which in medieval terms means until you die, which probably won't be that long, statistically speaking. Hours pass in the rice field. Your back starts cramping around hour 3. By hour 6, you can barely straighten up. By hour 9, you're wondering if dying might actually be more comfortable than continuing to live like this. But you continue because stopping isn't an option. Nakamura is still watching, and behind him, somewhere in the distance, are the samurai. The warrior class who enforce the social order through the simple expedient of being allowed to kill anyone who annoys them. That's not an exaggeration. Samurai have something called kirisute gomen, which literally means cut and leave. It's the legal right to kill anyone of lower social status who acts inappropriately. What counts as inappropriate? Pretty much anything a samurai decides is inappropriate. Failing to bow properly, speaking too loudly, looking someone in the eye when you shouldn't, walking on the wrong side of the road. These aren't minor social faux pas. They're potentially capital offences, depending on the mood of whoever happens to be carrying a sword. Around midday, you get a break. Not because anyone cares about your comfort, but because even feudal lords understand that dead workers don't produce rice. You sit on the edge of the field, your feet still dangling in the murky water, and eat your meal. Your meal consists of rice. Just rice. If you're exceptionally fortunate, there might be some pickled vegetables. If you're having the best day of your life, there might be a small piece of fish. But mostly, it's rice. The same thing you ate yesterday, and the day before that, and every day for your entire life. I heard there's going to be a festival next month, says Kenji, trying to inject some optimism into the group. Another excuse for higher taxes, Hiroshi responds, because festivals in feudal Japan aren't community celebrations. They're obligations. You're required to contribute to the celebration, whether you can afford it or not. And contributing means giving up food or money you desperately need for survival. At least we'll get to see the fire dancers, Yuki says. If we live that long, Tanaka adds cheerfully. Old man Tanaka has developed a philosophical approach to mortality that involves assuming he'll die any day now and being pleasantly surprised when he doesn't. The conversation is interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Everyone immediately tenses up. Horses mean samurai, and samurai mean potential trouble. Even when they're not actively trying to hurt you, their presence creates an atmosphere of danger. 3 mounted warriors approach the rice field. They're wearing armor that probably costs more than your village produces in a year. Their swords gleam in the sunlight, sharp enough to cut through bone without much effort. These aren't the noble, philosophical warriors from movies. These are armed enforcers of a brutal social system. The lead samurai surveys the field like he's inspecting livestock, which, from his perspective, he basically is. You and your fellow workers are economic units, valuable only as long as you produce more than you consume. Progress is slow, he announces to Nakamura. They're working as fast as they can, Nakamura replies nervously. Nobody wants to be the person who disappoints a samurai, because disappointed samurai tend to express their feelings through violence. Perhaps they need motivation, the samurai suggests, resting his hand on his sword hilt. The message is clear. Work faster or face consequences that involve sharp metal objects. This is medieval Japan's version of a performance review. You and the others immediately increase your pace, despite the fact that you were already working at maximum sustainable speed. But sustainability is a luxury when your life depends on keeping armed sociopaths happy. The samurai watch for a few more minutes, then ride away without another word. Their job is done. They've reminded everyone of their place in the social hierarchy through the simple expedient of showing up and looking threatening. That went well, Hiroshi mutters once they're safely out of earshot. The afternoon continues, much like the morning, except worse, because you're now exhausted and your body is starting to shut down. Your legs shake from standing in cold water. Your hands are raw from handling rice plants. Your back feels like someone is slowly tightening a vice around your spine. But you keep working because stopping means starving, and starving means dying, and dying means your family starves too, because there's no social safety net in feudal Japan, no unemployment benefits, no disability insurance, no pension plans. When you can't work anymore, you simply stop eating until you die. Around sunset, Nakamura finally calls an end to the workday. You drag yourself out of the rice field, feeling like you've aged several years in the span of 12 hours. Your legs barely support your weight as you walk back toward the village. Same time tomorrow, Nakamura calls after you, as if there were any other option. The walk home takes twice as long as the walk to work, because exhaustion makes every step an effort. You pass other villagers returning from their own forms of medieval employment. There's the blacksmith, covered in soot and burns from working near open flames all day. There's the carpenter, missing half his left hand from an accident with tools that have no safety features. There's the merchant who travels between villages, risking robbery and murder every time he ventures beyond familiar territory. Medieval Japan is filled with bandits, ronin, and other people who have decided that taking things from others is easier than producing things themselves. You reach your paper house as darkness falls. Inside, Your wife Michiko has prepared the evening meal. She looks as exhausted as you feel, having spent her day spinning thread, mending clothes, preparing food, and managing the dozens of tasks that keep a medieval household functioning. "How was your day?" she asks, though she already knows the answer. Every day is the same, difficult, exhausting, and designed to remind you that life is suffering. The samurai came by. You tell her. They seem disappointed with our progress. Michiko's face tightens with worry. Disappointing samurai is never good news, because disappointed samurai tend to take their frustrations out on the nearest available peasants. "Maybe we should work faster tomorrow," she suggests. "I don't think we can work any faster without dying," you reply. "Then maybe we should die faster and get it over with," she says. But she's smiling slightly when she says it. Dark humor is one of the few free entertainments available in medieval Japan. Your children, Akira and Emiko, sit quietly in the corner. Akira is 8 years old and already showing signs of the malnutrition that affects most peasant children. Emiko is 5 and small for her age because adequate nutrition is a luxury your family can't afford. Both children will start working in the fields within the next few years. There's no childhood in medieval Japan, at least not for people of your social class. You work until you die, and you start working as soon as you're physically capable of contributing to the family's survival. "Tell us a story," Emiko asks, looking up at you with the kind of hope that breaks your heart because you know how the world will crush that hope over the next few years. You sit down on the floor, your body grateful for any position that doesn't involve standing or bending. What kind of story do you tell children in feudal Japan? Stories about brave samurai are off limits because they might give your children ideas about social mobility. Stories about travel and adventure are dangerous because they might make your children dissatisfied with their predetermined fate. "Once upon a time," you begin, "there was a rice plant that worked very hard and grew very strong." It's not much of a story, but it's safe. It reinforces the values that keep medieval society functioning. Hard work, acceptance of your role, appreciation for simple survival. The children listen politely, though you can see in their eyes that they hunger for something more exciting. But exciting stories are for people who can afford excitement. Your children need to learn that life consists of work, endurance, and occasional moments of not quite starving. After the story, the family prepares for sleep. This involves laying out the straw mats and hoping that tomorrow won't be worse than today. It's not much to hope for, but in medieval Japan, modest hopes are the only ones that don't lead to crushing disappointment. You lie down on your mat, listening to the sounds of the village settling in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Closer by, you can hear someone coughing. The cough has been going on for weeks now, and everyone knows what that means. Disease spreads quickly in medieval villages where people live in close quarters, and medical knowledge consists mostly of hoping that prayer and luck will be sufficient to deal with whatever's trying to kill you. Sleep comes slowly, partly because your body hurts too much to relax, and partly because you know that tomorrow will bring more of the same. More rice fields, more back-breaking labor, more reminders that your life has been predetermined by forces completely beyond your control. But eventually, exhaustion wins over discomfort, and you drift off into the kind of sleep that medieval peasants experience. Not restful sleep, not refreshing sleep, just the temporary unconsciousness that allows your body to continue functioning for another day. You dream about rice, because when rice dominates your waking hours, it also dominates your sleeping hours. You dream about endless fields of rice plants, stretching to the horizon. You dream about standing in muddy water, bending over crops, while somewhere in the distance, samurai on horseback watch your every movement. You wake up before dawn, just like every other day. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your hands are stiff from yesterday's work. Your back feels like it belongs to someone much older than you actually are. But you get up anyway, because staying in bed isn't an option. The work bell is already ringing, and Nakamura will be counting heads to make sure everyone shows up on time. Missing work means losing pay, and losing pay means your family doesn't eat. Outside, it's raining again. Of course it's raining. Medieval Japan has two seasons, too wet and too dry. Right now, you're in the too wet season, which means you'll spend the day standing in rice fields that are even muddier and more unpleasant than usual. Hiroshi is already outside, looking like he slept about as well as you did. Another glorious day in paradise, he says, his voice heavy with sarcasm. At least we're not dead yet, you reply. Give it time, he responds. You walk toward the rice fields with the other villagers, all of you moving like people who are already exhausted before the day has begun. This is what medieval life looks like when you strip away the romantic nonsense. It's people who are tired all the time, hungry most of the time, and constantly aware that their lives could end at any moment for reasons completely beyond their control. The rice field looks even less appealing in the rain. The water is churned into a muddy soup that splashes up onto your clothes and skin every time you move. The plants are slippery and harder to handle. Everything takes more effort when you're working in conditions that would shut down a modern workplace for safety violations. But medieval Japan doesn't have workplace safety standards. It has an economic system based on extracting maximum productivity from human beings, with minimal regard for their comfort, health, or survival. You're not an employee with rights. You're a resource to be used until you're used up. Hours pass in the muddy water. Your feet go numb from the cold. Your clothes are soaked through and clinging to your skin. Your hair drips constantly into your eyes, making it hard to see what you're doing. Around mid-morning, you notice that old man Tanaka isn't moving as much as usual. He's standing still in the water, swaying slightly, his face pale and drawn. "Tanaka-san," you call out. "Are you all right?" He doesn't respond. He just stands there, staring at nothing, like he's forgotten where he is or what he's supposed to be doing. You wade over to him, moving as quickly as the mud allows. Up close, you can see that something is seriously wrong. His breathing is shallow and rapid. His skin has a greyish tint that you recognize from other people who have died in the village. "I think I need to sit down," Tanaka says quietly. But there's nowhere to sit except the muddy bank of the rice field. You help him out of the water, your own exhaustion making it difficult to support his weight. Other villagers notice what's happening and begin to gather around. "Should we get the doctor?" someone asks. "What doctor?" Hiroshi responds. "The nearest doctor is 3 days' walk from here, and he charges more than we make in a month." This is the reality of medical care in medieval Japan. It exists, technically, but it's not available to people like you. Doctors serve the wealthy. Everyone else relies on folk remedies, prayer, and hope. Tanaka sits on the muddy ground, his breathing becoming more labored. Everyone knows what's happening, but nobody knows what to do about it. This is how people die in medieval Japan. Not dramatically or heroically, but quietly and helplessly while their friends and family watch. "Maybe he just needs rest," Yuki suggests, though her voice lacks conviction. "Maybe," you agree, because sometimes lying to yourself is the only way to cope with situations you can't control. But Tanaka doesn't get better. He gets worse. Over the next hour, his breathing becomes increasingly difficult. His skin becomes grayer. His eyes lose focus, like he's seeing something the rest of you can't see. Nakamura approaches the group, looking annoyed rather than concerned. "What's the problem here?" he demands. "Tanaka-san is sick," you explain. "Then he should go home and get better," Nakamura says, as if illness is a matter of personal choice rather than biological reality. "I don't think he can make it home," Hiroshi says. Nakamura considers this information with the cold calculation of someone whose primary concern is productivity rather than human welfare. "Then someone needs to carry him," he decides. "But the rest of you need to keep working. The rice won't plant itself." So that's how it happens. Old man Tanaka, who has worked in these fields for more than 20 years, is carried home by 2 villagers while everyone else continues working. Because in medieval Japan, individual human suffering is less important than collective economic productivity. You don't find out until evening that Tanaka died before reaching his house. He simply stopped breathing while being carried along the muddy path between the rice field and the village. One moment he was alive, the next moment he wasn't. That's how death works in medieval Japan. It's sudden, arbitrary, and completely indifferent to your plans or preferences. At least he doesn't have to work tomorrow, Hiroshi says when he hears the news. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's also true. In a world where life consists almost entirely of suffering, death can seem like a form of relief. That's how brutal medieval existence is. It makes non-existence look appealing by comparison. The next morning, there's no funeral for Tanaka. Funerals are expensive, and his family can't afford the ceremony. Instead, his body is buried in a simple grave, marked only by a wooden stick with his name carved into it. Within a few years, weather will erase the carving, and there will be no evidence that he ever existed. This is how most people in medieval Japan are remembered. They're not remembered. They live, they work, they die, and then they're forgotten. No monuments, no historical records, no lasting impact on the world. They're just statistical entries in the great ledger of human suffering. You're back in the rice field, working in the space where Tanaka used to stand. His absence makes the group smaller, but the work doesn't decrease. Everyone else just has to work a little harder to make up for the missing productivity. I wonder who's next, Kenji says quietly. It's a reasonable question. In a village where people die regularly from disease, accident, malnutrition, and exhaustion, death isn't a distant possibility. It's an immediate neighbor who could visit anyone at any time. Probably me, Hiroshi says. I've been coughing for 2 weeks now. Don't be so pessimistic, Yuki tells him. You might live another month. Thanks for the encouragement, he replies. This is what passes for optimism in medieval Japan. Maybe you'll live another month. Maybe you won't die tomorrow. Maybe you'll have enough food to eat this week. The bar for hope is set extremely low because setting it any higher leads to disappointment that you can't afford. The work continues. Day after day, week after week, season after season. You stand in muddy water, bend over rice plants, and perform the same repetitive motions that define peasant existence. Your body grows more worn down with each passing day. Your hands become more scarred. Your back becomes more curved. But you also develop a kind of grim endurance that comes from having no choice but to endure. You learn to ignore pain that would incapacitate a modern person. You learn to function on amounts of food that would be considered starvation rations today. You learn to find moments of satisfaction in circumstances that would drive most people to despair. One morning, the work bell doesn't ring at the usual time. Instead, you're awakened by the sound of horses and shouting. Lots of horses, lots of shouting. None of it sounds good. You peer out through the paper walls of your house and see armed men everywhere. Not the local samurai you're used to. These are different warriors, wearing different armor, carrying different banners. They're moving through the village systematically, going from house to house. What's happening? Michiko whispers. I think we're being conquered, you whisper back. This is another reality of medieval Japan. Political control changes frequently, often violently, and peasants like you have no say in the matter. You belong to whoever happens to control your area at any given moment. Your feudal loyalty shifts automatically to whoever has the most swords. The new conquerors are efficient in their takeover. They gather all the villagers in the central area and make an announcement through an interpreter. This village now belongs to Lord Yamamoto, the interpreter declares. All previous obligations are void. New obligations will be announced shortly. This sounds like it might be good news, but you've lived in medieval Japan long enough to know that changes in leadership rarely benefit peasants. New lords typically mean new taxes, new rules, and new opportunities for things to go wrong. What about our crops? Someone calls out. All crops belong to Lord Yamamoto, the interpreter responds. You will be allowed to keep a portion for survival purposes. A portion for survival purposes. That's the most generous offer you can expect in medieval Japan. You don't get to keep what you produce. You get to survive on whatever your feudal lord decides you need to keep working. What if the portion isn't enough? Another villager asks. Then you'll need less, the interpreter says, as if starvation is simply a matter of adjusting your expectations. The new regime brings new rules. You're no longer allowed to leave the village without permission. You're required to work an additional day each week for Lord Yamamoto's personal projects. You're forbidden from gathering wild foods in the forest because the forest now belongs exclusively to the Lord. These changes might seem minor, but in a subsistence economy, minor changes can be the difference between survival and death. That extra day of work means less time for maintaining your house, caring for your family, or recovering from the physical toll of constant labor. The restriction on foraging means losing access to foods that supplement your rice-based diet. Wild vegetables, nuts, berries, and roots provided essential nutrients that you can't get from rice alone. Without them, malnutrition becomes more severe and more widespread. But complaining isn't an option. The new samurai make it clear that they're prepared to enforce the new rules through whatever means necessary. They've already made examples of people in other villages who questioned the changes. Those examples involved public executions designed to discourage further questioning. So you adapt, because adaptation is the only alternative to death. You work the extra day, even though your body can barely handle the current workload. You ignore your hunger when wild foods aren't available. You smile and bow when samurai pass by, even though you'd rather spit in their faces. This is what survival looks like in medieval Japan. It's not heroic or noble. It's the constant suppression of your own needs, preferences, and dignity in service of staying alive one more day. Months pass under the new regime. Some villagers adapt better than others. Some don't adapt at all. 3 more people die during the transition, unable to handle the increased demands on their already depleted systems. One of them is Kenji, the farmer who lost 3 fingers in an accident. The extra workday proved too much for his compromised physical condition. He collapsed in the rice field one afternoon and never got up again. Another is a young mother named Sato, who died trying to breastfeed her infant while suffering from severe malnutrition. The restriction on foraging eliminated foods she needed to produce milk for her baby. Both mother and child died within days of each other. The third is a teenager named Jiro, who made the mistake of questioning why Lord Yamamoto needed so much rice when villagers were starving. His questioning was interpreted as rebellion, and rebellion in medieval Japan is punishable by death. Jiro's execution was public and brutal, designed to remind everyone of their place in the social hierarchy. He was forced to kneel in the village center, while a samurai practiced sword techniques on his neck. It took 3 attempts to completely sever his head, and the samurai seemed annoyed by his own imprecision rather than disturbed by the act of killing a teenager. This is the reality of justice in medieval Japan. It's not about fairness or proportionality. It's about maintaining social control through fear and intimidation. The message is clear: question authority and die horribly in front of your friends and family. After Jiro's execution, nobody questions anything anymore. People work their extra day without complaint. They ignore their hunger without comment. They bow deeply to every samurai they encounter, hoping that sufficient displays of submission will keep them alive. But submission doesn't guarantee survival. It just reduces the likelihood of being killed for political reasons. You can still die from disease, accident, malnutrition, exhaustion, or any of the other hazards that make medieval life a constant struggle against mortality. Winter arrives early and harsh. The rice harvest was smaller than usual due to the disruptions caused by regime change. Food stores that would normally last until spring will be exhausted by midwinter. Everyone knows what this means, but nobody discusses it openly because discussing it won't change anything. People begin dying of starvation in late autumn. First, the elderly, whose bodies can't survive on reduced rations. Then the children, whose growing bodies need more nutrition than scarce food supplies can provide. Finally, the adults who sacrifice their own portions to try to keep their families alive. You watch your neighbors waste away gradually, their bodies consuming themselves in a desperate attempt to maintain basic biological functions. Their faces become gaunt. Their eyes sink into their skulls. Their clothes hang loose on frames that shrink daily. Your own family isn't immune to the effects of hunger. Akira develops the listless behavior that indicates severe malnutrition. Emiko stops growing and begins to resemble a tiny old person rather than a 5-year-old child. Michiko's hair starts falling out, and her skin takes on the greyish pallor that you've learned to associate with impending death. You're not doing much better yourself. Your ribs are visible through your skin. Your legs shake when you walk. Your mind has trouble focusing on anything except food, which occupies your thoughts constantly, even though thinking about food makes the hunger worse. But you continue working because stopping work means losing your food allocation entirely. Even starvation rations are better than no rations at all. So, you drag yourself to the rice fields every morning, perform the minimum amount of work necessary to avoid punishment, and drag yourself home every evening. The work is harder now because malnutrition affects your strength and coordination. Tasks that were once routine now require tremendous effort. You move more slowly, make more mistakes, and need more rest breaks. But rest breaks aren't allowed, so you work through the exhaustion and hope that your body holds together long enough to survive until spring. Spring feels impossibly far away. Each day stretches endlessly, filled with hunger pangs, physical weakness, and the constant awareness that you might not live to see tomorrow. This is what starvation feels like, when it's not a temporary inconvenience, but a long-term reality that could end in death. Some families make desperate decisions. They send their children to other villages, hoping that relatives or strangers might have enough food to keep them alive. They sell personal possessions for tiny amounts of rice. They eat things that aren't really food: bark, grass, leather, anything that might fill their stomachs temporarily. These measures rarely work, but desperation makes people try impossible solutions. When you're watching your family die slowly, you'll attempt anything that offers even the smallest chance of survival. One morning, you wake up and find that Hiroshi didn't make it through the night. He died in his sleep, which is considered a fortunate way to go in medieval Japan. No pain, no struggle, just the quiet transition from exhausted sleep to permanent rest. His death shouldn't surprise you. He'd been growing weaker for weeks, and everyone knew he was running out of time. But it still hits you hard, because Hiroshi was your closest friend, and the person who helped make the daily misery bearable through shared sarcasm and dark humor. Without Hiroshi, the workdays become even more unbearable. There's nobody to make sardonic comments about the absurdity of your situation. Nobody to share the small observations that made suffering feel slightly less isolating. Just you, the rice field, and the constant awareness that you might be next. But somehow, you're not next. Somehow, your body continues functioning despite the lack of adequate nutrition. Somehow, your family survives the worst of the winter and makes it to early spring, when the first wild plants begin appearing and food becomes slightly more available. The survival feels almost accidental, like you won a lottery you didn't know you were entered in. Many families weren't as fortunate. The village population is significantly smaller than it was 6 months ago. Empty houses stand as monuments to people who didn't make it through the winter. Spring brings new challenges along with new hopes. The rice planting season requires more energy than winter work, but your body has less energy available than it had before the famine. You're weaker, slower, and less capable of handling physical demands. But you handle them anyway because the alternative is death. You plant rice in the muddy fields, tend the growing plants through the summer, and harvest the crop in autumn, just like every year before. The cycle continues, regardless of how many people it kills along the way. Years pass in this pattern. Work, survival, loss, adaptation, repeat. Some years are worse than others, but none are what you'd call good. Medieval Japan doesn't offer good years to people of your social class. It offers varying degrees of hardship, with survival being the best possible outcome. You age rapidly under the constant stress. By 30, you look 50. By 40, you feel ancient. Your body bears the accumulated damage of decades spent performing back-breaking labor under conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. Your hands are permanently deformed from rice work. Your fingers are crooked from repetitive motions. Your palms are covered in calluses, so thick they feel like leather. Your back is curved into a permanent question mark from decades of bending over crops. But you're still alive, which makes you one of the lucky ones. Most people from your childhood are dead now. Disease, accident, starvation, violence, or simple exhaustion claimed them over the years. You've outlived your parents, most of your siblings, and many of your own children. Because yes, you've had more children over the years, not out of optimism about the future, but because children are the only form of social security available in medieval Japan. If you survive to old age, your children are the only thing standing between you and starvation when you become too weak to work. Most of your children didn't survive to adulthood. Medieval Japan has an infant mortality rate that would horrify modern parents. Diseases that are easily treatable today were death sentences then. Malnutrition, accidents, and simple bad luck killed children regularly and randomly. You and Michiko had 6 children total. 2 died in infancy from diseases you couldn't identify or treat. 1 died at age 7 from an infected wound that became septic. Another died at 12 from what was probably appendicitis, though medical knowledge wasn't advanced enough to diagnose or treat it. Only Akira and Emiko survived to adulthood, and even that survival came at tremendous cost. Both bear the physical and psychological scars of growing up in medieval Japan. Akira has the stooped posture and gnarled hands of someone who started working in rice fields before his body was fully developed. Emiko has the hollow eyes and careful movements of someone who learned early that life is dangerous and unpredictable. Both of your surviving children are now adults with families of their own. They live in the same village, work in the same rice fields, and face the same daily struggles that have defined your entire existence. The cycle continues, generation after generation, with each new group of children learning that life consists primarily of work, suffering, and premature death. This is the reality of social mobility in medieval Japan. There isn't any. You're born into a social class and you die in that social class. Your children inherit your social position, along with your debts, obligations, and limitations. The idea that hard work might lead to a better life is a fantasy that medieval Japanese society actively discourages. The samurai class maintains this system through a combination of legal restrictions and violent enforcement. Peasants aren't allowed to carry weapons, change occupations, move to different areas, or accumulate wealth that might threaten the existing social order. Any attempt to improve your situation is interpreted as a challenge to the natural hierarchy and dealt with accordingly. You've seen what happens to people who try to change their circumstances. They're made into public examples of why such attempts are futile and dangerous. The message is clear. Accept your fate or die trying to change it. So you accept your fate, not because you're happy with it, but because acceptance is the only rational response to a situation you can't control. You work in the rice fields, bow to samurai, pay your taxes, and hope that your children might somehow have slightly better lives than you've had. It's not much of a hope, but it's the only one available to people in your position. One day, when you're in your 50s and feeling like you're in your 80s, something unusual happens. A group of foreign merchants passes through your village. They're not Japanese, and they're definitely not from anywhere you've ever heard of. They have pale skin, strange clothes, and equipment you don't recognize. The villagers gather to stare at these exotic visitors, whispering among themselves about where such people might have come from. The merchants seem equally fascinated by the villagers, pointing and talking in a language that sounds nothing like Japanese. One of the merchants carries a device that makes loud noises and produces smoke. He demonstrates it for the crowd, causing most people to jump back in alarm. Some villagers fall to their knees, thinking they're witnessing supernatural phenomena. But you recognize what you're seeing, even though you've never seen it before. These people have weapons that work differently from swords and spears. weapons that could potentially change the balance of power that has kept you trapped in rice fields your entire life. The thought is both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it suggests that the current social order might not be as permanent as you've been told. Terrifying because change in medieval Japan usually means war, and war means suffering for people like you. The foreign merchants stay in the village for 3 days, trading small metal objects for rice and other local products. They're polite but distant, clearly from a world so different from yours that meaningful communication is almost impossible. When they leave, they take with them detailed observations about Japanese society, military capabilities, and economic systems. You don't know it at the time, but these merchants are part of a larger process that will eventually transform Japan completely. But that transformation is still decades in the future, and you'll be dead long before it happens. For now, life continues exactly as it always has. The foreign merchants become a story that people tell during the long winter evenings, but they don't change anything about daily existence. You continue working in the rice fields. You continue bowing to samurai. You continue surviving on minimal food and hoping that tomorrow won't be worse than today. The visit from strange foreigners becomes just another memory in a life filled with small incidents that briefly interrupt the monotony of peasant existence. Years pass. Your body continues to deteriorate under the constant strain of agricultural labor. Your mind remains sharp, but your physical capabilities decline steadily. You move more slowly, tire more easily, and require more recovery time between periods of intensive work. The village leadership begins making subtle suggestions that you should consider stepping back from full-time field work. This isn't kindness or concern for your welfare. It's economic calculation. Older workers are less productive and more likely to get injured, and injuries mean lost work time for everyone involved. But stepping back from fieldwork means accepting a significant reduction in food allocation. You'll receive smaller rations because you're contributing less to village productivity. The reduction might be enough to push you from chronic hunger into actual starvation. So you continue working despite your declining physical condition. You drag yourself to the rice fields every morning, perform whatever tasks you're still capable of handling, and hope that your body holds together long enough to avoid destitution. This is what growing old looks like in medieval Japan. There's no retirement, no pension, no gradual transition to a life of leisure. You work until you die, or until you become so incapacitated that you're considered a burden rather than an asset. The lucky ones die quickly from heart attacks or strokes. The unlucky ones linger for months or years, slowly starving while their families struggle to care for them with resources that are already inadequate for basic survival. You hope you'll be one of the lucky ones when your time comes. A quick death while working in the rice fields seems preferable to a slow decline marked by increasing helplessness and hunger. But death, like everything else in medieval Japan, doesn't follow your preferences or schedule. When it comes, in whatever form it chooses, regardless of your hopes or plans. One autumn morning, you're working in the rice fields when you notice that your vision is becoming blurry. Not just tired eyes or temporary strain, but a persistent haziness that makes it difficult to focus on the plants in front of you. You try to ignore the problem and continue working, but the blurriness gets worse throughout the day. By evening, you're having trouble seeing well enough to walk safely on the uneven ground between the fields and the village. Michiko notices your difficulty immediately when you arrive home. After 50 years of marriage, she can read your physical condition better than you can. Your eyes are getting worse, she observes. They're just tired, you reply, though you both know that's not true. Maybe you should see the monk, she suggests. He knows about healing herbs. The village monk is the closest thing to a doctor available to people of your social class. He has some knowledge of traditional remedies and occasionally succeeds in treating minor ailments. But his success rate with serious medical problems is approximately the same as random chance. Still, consulting the monk costs nothing except time, and time is one of the few resources you can afford to spend. The next day, you visit the small temple where the monk lives and works. He examines your eyes by looking at them closely in different lighting conditions. His diagnostic technique consists mainly of asking questions about symptoms and making educated guesses based on his limited medical knowledge. Your eyes are wearing out, he concludes after his examination. It happens to people who do close work for many years. This diagnosis isn't particularly helpful, since it doesn't suggest any treatment options. But at least it confirms that your vision problems are real rather than imaginary. Is there anything I can do about it? You ask. Pray, the monk suggests. Sometimes prayer helps with these conditions. Prayer is the standard medical recommendation for problems that don't have obvious solutions. It's free, harmless, and occasionally provides psychological comfort, even when it doesn't produce physical improvement. You thank the monk for his time and return home with the knowledge that your vision will probably continue deteriorating until you're functionally blind. This is a serious problem in a world where survival depends on your ability to perform detailed agricultural work. But like every other problem in your life, this one will have to be managed rather than solved. You'll adapt your work techniques to accommodate reduced vision. You'll rely more heavily on other senses and develop new strategies for accomplishing familiar tasks. Over the following months, your eyesight continues to decline. You can still see general shapes and movement, but fine details become increasingly difficult to distinguish. This makes rice work much more challenging and dangerous. You compensate by working more slowly and carefully, feeling your way through tasks that you used to perform automatically. Other villagers begin helping you with activities that require precise vision, though their assistance comes at the cost of their own productivity. The village leadership tolerates this arrangement for a while, but eventually decides that your declining capabilities are affecting overall efficiency. They inform you that your work assignments will be reduced to tasks that don't require good eyesight. This means a corresponding reduction in food allocation. You'll receive less rice because you're contributing less labor. The reduction isn't enough to kill you immediately, but it's enough to accelerate the slow starvation that affects most elderly peasants. Michiko suggests that you might qualify for temple charity, which occasionally provides food for people who can't work. But temple charity is limited and unreliable, distributed according to criteria that favor people with family connections to religious officials. You apply anyway, because any additional food source could mean the difference between survival and death. The application process involves demonstrating your need to temple officials who have the authority to grant or deny assistance. The temple officials are sympathetic but explain that resources are limited and many people need help. They'll add your name to a list of potential recipients, but they can't guarantee that assistance will be available when you need it. This is how social welfare works in medieval Japan. It exists in theory but functions poorly in practice. Religious institutions provide some help to some people some of the time, but the system is inadequate for the scale of human need it's supposed to address. So you return home with reduced food rations and the knowledge that further help might or might not be forthcoming. You'll have to survive on less nutrition while hoping that your physical condition doesn't deteriorate faster than your remaining resources can sustain. The adjustment to reduced food intake is difficult even though you've been hungry for most of your adult life. There's a significant difference between chronic malnutrition and the acute hunger that comes from eating substantially less food than your body requires for basic functioning. You lose weight rapidly, and the weight loss affects your strength and coordination even more than the vision problems do. Simple tasks become exhausting. Walking short distances leaves you breathless. Your body begins consuming its own muscle tissue to maintain essential biological functions. Michiko shares her food with you whenever possible, but she's also elderly and needs adequate nutrition to maintain her own health. Sharing food that's already insufficient means that both of you become weaker, rather than one person maintaining reasonable health. Your children help when they can, but they have their own families to feed, and their own struggles with food scarcity. The economic reality of medieval Japan means that resources are always stretched thin, leaving little surplus for supporting people who can't contribute labor. This is the harsh mathematics of subsistence living, When total resources barely meet total needs, any reduction in individual productivity threatens the survival of the entire community. Compassion is a luxury that requires more resources than are typically available. Winter approaches with the usual anxiety about food supplies and heating fuel. This year, the anxiety is more acute because your reduced food allocation means less margin for error if weather conditions are particularly harsh, or the stored grain runs out sooner than expected. You spend the short autumn days gathering whatever free resources are available. Fallen branches for fuel, edible wild plants that haven't been consumed by other hungry villagers, anything that might supplement your inadequate food rations. The gathering activities are difficult with poor eyesight, but you develop techniques for identifying useful materials by touch and smell. Necessity forces you to become more creative about survival strategies, even though creativity can't overcome the fundamental problem of insufficient resources. The first snow arrives early, trapping everyone in their houses for days at a time. Snow days in medieval Japan aren't charming or picturesque. They're periods of enforced inactivity when you burn through fuel and food reserves while hoping that weather conditions improve before supplies run out. You spend the snow days lying on your straw mat, conserving energy and trying not to think about food. Thinking about food when you're hungry makes the hunger worse, but not thinking about food when you're hungry is almost impossible. Michiko tells stories to help pass the time, stories about better days when food was more plentiful and life was slightly less difficult, stories about people who lived longer and died peacefully surrounded by their families, stories that provide temporary escape from current reality. But the stories end, and reality returns, and you're still hungry and cold and wondering if you'll survive until spring. This is what hope looks like in medieval Japan. It's not optimism about the future, it's simply the absence of complete despair. Days pass slowly in the winter darkness. You sleep more than usual, partly because sleep requires less energy than staying awake, and partly because sleep provides temporary relief from hunger and discomfort. When you're awake, you listen to the sounds of the village around you. Other families coping with similar problems. Children crying from hunger. Adults moving carefully to conserve energy. The occasional sound of someone who didn't make it through another night. Death is a regular visitor during medieval Japanese winters. People who were marginally surviving during warmer months often can't handle the additional stress of cold weather and reduced activity. Their bodies simply stop functioning when resource demands exceed available supplies. You wonder if this will be the winter when your own body decides it's had enough. The thought isn't particularly frightening anymore. After decades of struggle and suffering, death seems more like rest than tragedy. But your body proves more resilient than you expected. Somehow, you make it through the worst of the winter and into early spring, when slightly warmer weather makes survival marginally easier. Spring brings new challenges along with relief from winter conditions. The rice planting season requires community cooperation and coordinated effort, but you're no longer capable of participating in agricultural work that requires good vision and steady hands. Instead, you're assigned to tasks that can be performed by people with physical limitations, sorting seeds by feel, repairing simple tools, watching for birds or animals that might damage crops. Work that contributes to village productivity without requiring capabilities you no longer possess. The work assignments come with reduced food rations, but they're better than no work and no food. You're grateful for any opportunity to contribute to community survival, even though the contributions are minimal compared to what you provided during your productive years. Summer passes in this pattern of limited work and limited resources. You do what you can, eat what you're given, and hope that your reduced circumstances remain stable rather than continuing to deteriorate. Autumn brings the rice harvest, which determines food availability for the following year. It's a good harvest by medieval standards, which means there will be enough food to prevent mass starvation but not enough to eliminate chronic hunger. For you personally, the good harvest means that your reduced food rations might be sufficient to sustain life through another winter. Not comfortable life, but survival at the most basic biological level. This is what constitutes good news in medieval Japan, not prosperity or happiness or security, just the possibility of continued existence under conditions that would be considered intolerable by people with other options. But you don't have other options, so you're grateful for small improvements in desperate circumstances. Gratitude is a survival skill in medieval Japan because despair uses energy you can't afford to waste. Another winter passes, much like the previous one but with slightly better food supplies. You survive, though survival feels more accidental than planned. Your body continues functioning despite conditions that should probably have killed you by now. Spring returns again, bringing another cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting. You continue performing whatever limited work your physical condition allows, contributing what you can to community survival. Years pass in this pattern. Not good years or bad years, just years that happen one after another, while you continue existing in circumstances that test the limits of human endurance. You celebrate no birthdays because birth dates aren't recorded for people of your social class. You mark time by rice harvests and seasonal changes rather than personal milestones. Age is measured by physical decline rather than chronological years. Gradually, even the limited work assignments become too difficult for your declining capabilities. Your hands shake too much for delicate tasks. Your legs can't support your weight for extended periods. Your eyesight deteriorates to the point where you can barely distinguish light from darkness. The village leadership makes the inevitable decision. You're no longer capable of contributing enough labor to justify full food rations. Your allocation will be reduced to the minimum necessary to prevent immediate starvation. This isn't cruelty or callousness. It's mathematical necessity in a community where total food production barely meets total survival needs. Resources must be allocated based on productivity rather than compassion, because compassionate allocation would result in everyone dying instead of just some people dying. You understand the logic even though you don't like the consequences. The village has to prioritize people who can work over people who can't work. Your reduced rations are actually a form of charity, since pure economic calculation would suggest providing no food at all to non-productive individuals. But understanding the logic doesn't make hunger any more comfortable or survival any less difficult. You're now living on food supplies that are insufficient for long-term survival, which means that your remaining time is measured in months rather than years. Michiko's health is also declining, though not as rapidly as yours. She can still perform simple household tasks and contribute to community activities. Her food allocation remains larger than yours, which creates the awkward situation where she has slightly more to eat than you do. She shares her food with you whenever possible, but sharing inadequate resources just means that both of you become malnourished rather than one person maintaining reasonable health. It's a gesture of love that makes practical survival more difficult for both parties. Your children visit when they can, bringing small amounts of extra food and assistance with tasks you can no longer perform independently. But their visits are brief, because they have their own families and responsibilities that require constant attention. This is how family relationships work in medieval Japan. Love and loyalty exist, but they're constrained by economic realities that limit how much help people can provide to each other. Everyone is struggling with survival, leaving little surplus capacity for supporting relatives who can't support themselves. One morning, you wake up and realize that you can't see anything at all. Not blurry vision or poor focus, but complete darkness. Your eyes have finally stopped functioning entirely, leaving you dependent on other senses for information about your surroundings. The transition to complete blindness is both terrifying and oddly liberating. Terrifying because it eliminates your ability to navigate independently or perform even simple tasks without assistance. Liberating because it removes the last pretense that you might still be capable of productive work. Now your situation is clear to everyone, including yourself. You're completely dependent on other people for survival. You can't work, can't move around safely, and can't take care of your basic needs without help. In modern society, this would be the point where various support systems would activate to help you maintain some quality of life despite your disabilities. In medieval Japan, This is the point where you begin the final phase of your existence. Michiko becomes your primary caregiver, guiding you through daily activities and helping you avoid obstacles that you can't see. She describes what's happening around you, reads visual information aloud, and generally serves as your interface with a world that you can no longer perceive directly. But Michiko is also elderly and dealing with her own health problems. Serving as your caregiver while managing her own decline creates a burden that exhausts her remaining energy and accelerates her physical deterioration. The village community provides some assistance, but resources are limited and other people have their own problems to manage. You receive help when it's convenient for others to provide it, but you can't count on help being available when you need it most. This is the reality of disability in medieval Japan. Some support exists within family and community networks, but the support is informal, inconsistent, and dependent on the goodwill of people who are also struggling with their own survival challenges. You adapt to blindness by developing enhanced reliance on hearing, touch, and smell. You learn to navigate familiar spaces by counting steps and using landmarks that you can identify through non-visual senses. You memorize the location of objects and furniture to avoid constantly bumping into things. But adaptation has limits when your environment is inherently dangerous and your support systems are inadequate. You fall frequently, injuring yourself on objects you can't see. You miss meals when food is placed in locations you can't find. You become lost and disoriented when familiar routines are disrupted. Each incident reinforces your awareness that you're now a liability rather than an asset to community survival. You consume resources without producing anything in return. You require assistance that diverts other people from their own survival activities. This awareness creates a psychological burden that might be worse than the physical challenges of blindness. You know that your continued existence makes life more difficult for people you care about. You know that your death would actually improve their chances of survival. But suicide isn't really an option in medieval Japan, partly because of religious prohibitions and partly because effective suicide methods aren't easily available to someone with your physical limitations. You're trapped in a situation where continued living and dying are both difficult. So you continue existing day by day, accepting help when it's offered and trying not to burden others more than necessary. You listen to conversations around you, enjoy whatever small pleasures are still available, and wait for natural death to end your struggles. The wait isn't particularly long. Your body, weakened by decades of hard labor and chronic malnutrition, begins shutting down in the predictable pattern of organ failure that affects most elderly peasants in medieval Japan. Your appetite disappears, though this isn't particularly significant since you barely had enough food to satisfy your appetite anyway. Your sleep patterns become irregular, with periods of unconsciousness alternating with periods of confused wakefulness. Your breathing becomes more labored as your lungs fill with fluid that your weakened cardiovascular system can't process effectively. Your skin takes on the greyish pallor that indicates approaching death in medieval Japan. Michiko sits with you during the final days, describing what's happening in the village and telling stories about better times in your shared past. Her presence provides comfort even though there's nothing she can do to change the outcome of your decline. Your children visit to say goodbye, though goodbyes in medieval Japan aren't dramatic or emotionally demonstrative events. Death is too common and too expected for elaborate emotional displays. People say what needs to be said quickly and quietly, then return to their own survival activities. The end, when it comes, is surprisingly peaceful. Your breathing simply becomes more shallow and then stops entirely during an afternoon nap. No struggle, no pain, just the quiet transition from exhausted life to permanent rest. Your death is noted by the village officials as a minor administrative matter, one less person to feed during the upcoming winter, one less allocation of resources required for survival. Your passing creates a small increase in available resources that will be redistributed among the surviving community members. There's no funeral ceremony, because funerals cost money and resources that your family doesn't have. Your body is buried in an unmarked grave that will be forgotten within a few years as other graves are added to the village cemetery. Your life, like the lives of most people in medieval Japan, leaves no lasting historical record. No monuments, no written accounts, no evidence that you ever existed except in the memories of people who will themselves die within a few years. But your life, anonymous and forgotten though it was, represents the experience of millions of people who lived and died in medieval Japan without anyone recording their stories or acknowledging their struggles. You were born into a social system that offered no choices, no opportunities for advancement, and no escape from predetermined hardship. You worked every day of your adult life in conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. You survived famines, diseases, natural disasters, and social upheavals that killed many of your contemporaries. You raised children under circumstances that made parenthood an exercise in hope against overwhelming odds. You maintained relationships and communities despite economic pressures that encouraged selfishness and competition. You found moments of joy and satisfaction in circumstances that offered few reasons for happiness. Your life was hard in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. You experienced levels of hunger, discomfort, insecurity, and physical suffering that would break most people who live in developed societies today. But you endured. You survived for decades in conditions that would defeat most modern humans within weeks. You adapted to circumstances that required tremendous psychological resilience and practical creativity. Your endurance wasn't heroic or noble in the Hollywood sense. It was simply the stubborn persistence of someone who had no choice but to keep going despite overwhelming difficulties. It was the quiet strength of people who face impossible situations and somehow find ways to continue existing. This is the real story of medieval Japan, stripped of romantic nonsense about noble samurai and graceful geishas. It's the story of ordinary people living extraordinary difficult lives with remarkable resilience and dignity. Their struggles weren't glamorous or photogenic. Their achievements weren't recorded in history books or celebrated in popular culture. But their lives matter because they represent the human capacity to endure suffering while maintaining compassion, community, and hope. Modern life, for all its stresses and anxieties, offers luxuries that medieval Japanese peasants couldn't even imagine. Food security, medical care, social mobility, individual rights, and countless conveniences that we take for granted would seem miraculous to someone from that era. Your modern bed with its comfortable mattress and clean sheets represents wealth beyond the dreams of medieval peasants. Your access to clean water, electricity, transportation, and communication technology would seem like magic to people who lived and died without ever traveling more than a few miles from their birthplace. The challenges you face in modern life are real and significant, but they're qualitatively different from the challenges that defined existence in medieval Japan. You worry about career advancement, relationship problems, and financial security. Medieval peasants worried about starving to death, dying from preventable diseases, and being killed for minor social infractions. This doesn't mean that modern problems aren't real, or that historical perspective should make you grateful for everything in your current life. But it does suggest that human beings are remarkably adaptable and resilient creatures, capable of finding meaning and dignity even in circumstances that seem impossible to endure. The people who lived and died in medieval Japan weren't fundamentally different from people today. They had the same basic emotional needs, the same desire for security and happiness, the same capacity for love and creativity and hope. What was different was the context in which they had to pursue those universal human goals. They lived in a world where survival required constant struggle, where social systems offered no mobility or choice, and where death was always nearby. Yet they created communities, raised families, developed cultures, and found ways to make meaning from their difficult lives. They demonstrated that human dignity doesn't depend on comfortable circumstances, and that resilience doesn't require optimistic expectations about the future. Their stories remind us that survival itself is an achievement worth recognizing, that endurance in the face of overwhelming difficulties is a form of courage, and that ordinary people living extraordinary difficult lives deserve to be remembered and honored. So as you settle into your comfortable modern bed tonight, surrounded by conveniences and securities that medieval peasants couldn't imagine, take a moment to acknowledge the quiet heroes who came before you. The people who lived and died in rice fields and paper houses, who faced impossible challenges with remarkable dignity, and who somehow found ways to create meaning and community, despite circumstances that would break most people today. Their lives were hard, but they were not meaningless. Their struggles were overwhelming, but they were not pointless. They endured so that human civilization could continue, generation after generation, eventually creating the world that allows you to lie safely in a warm bed while learning about their forgotten stories. Rest well tonight, knowing that you're part of a long chain of human endurance that stretches back through countless generations of people who faced impossible odds and somehow kept going. Sleep peacefully, grateful for the countless conveniences that separate your life from theirs, but respectful of the strength and dignity they showed in circumstances that would challenge anyone's capacity for survival. And maybe, when you wake up tomorrow morning in your climate-controlled room with access to clean water and abundant food, you'll remember for just a moment what an extraordinary luxury your ordinary life really represents. Not because you should feel guilty about having advantages that others lacked, but because recognizing those advantages might help you appreciate the remarkable progress that human societies have made in reducing unnecessary suffering. The people who lived and died in medieval Japan didn't suffer so that future generations could learn lessons or feel grateful. They suffered because suffering was simply the default condition of human existence in their time and place. But their suffering wasn't meaningless if we can learn from their stories to create societies that offer more choices, more security, and more opportunities for human flourishing. Their endurance becomes meaningful if we use our advantages to reduce suffering for people who are still struggling against overwhelming odds in various parts of the world today. So sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake up tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for both the luxuries you enjoy and the responsibilities those luxuries create. The long story of human struggle continues, but with each generation, we have more tools and opportunities to write better chapters in that ongoing story. The rice fields of medieval Japan are gone now, replaced by modern agriculture that feeds people more efficiently and safely. The paper houses have been replaced by structures that provide real protection from weather and disaster. The social systems that trapped people in predetermined roles have been replaced by societies that offer more choices and opportunities. Progress isn't perfect, and modern life creates new forms of suffering even as it eliminates older ones. But the overall trajectory of human civilization has moved toward reducing unnecessary hardship and expanding opportunities for people to create meaningful lives. That progress happened because people in every generation have worked to improve conditions for future generations, often without seeing the results of their efforts. The medieval Japanese peasants who lived and died in rice fields contributed to that progress simply by surviving long enough to raise children who could continue the long process of human advancement. Their contributions weren't dramatic or heroic, but they were essential. Every day they endured was a day that kept human civilization moving forward. Every child they raised, despite overwhelming difficulties, was a future generation that could build on their struggles. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, surrounded by the comfort and security that their endurance helped make possible, remember that your own life is part of that same ongoing story. What you do with the advantages you've inherited will help determine what opportunities are available to future generations. Sleep well and dream of better worlds that might be possible if each generation continues building on the struggles and achievements of those who came before. The long story of human resilience continues, and you're part of writing whatever comes next.